Hello, I'm Julie Hamill. I'm a lawyer and a planning commissioner out in Rancho Palos Verdes, California. And I wish that I could be there live with you today. I'm very envious of everyone who gets to be together in a room. I miss being around people, and I'm looking forward to doing that again someday, hopefully very soon. So let's get to it. I'll share my screen here. And hopefully this is working on your end. Um, So I want to make it clear that I am not selling anything today. I'm not encouraging you to invest in anything. I don't represent any of these companies or groups that I'll be talking to you about. I am here purely for educational purposes. My goal is to, number one, not bore you to death. And number two is to provide you with the tools and a basic understanding to enable you to think critically about these blockchain solutions when you start to see them in your work, if you haven't already. Um, so, my hot and cold love affair with blockchain began a few years ago over Thanksgiving. And my brother in law, who is much younger and much cooler than I am, was reading a magazine that all of the Silicon Valley tech bros like to read. So I picked it up, and there was an article about blockchain and cryptocurrency and smart contracts. And it made it sound like it was the new internet. It was the newest, coolest, hottest thing. And it also sounded like something that might put me out of a job. I was reading about smart contracts and how basically these things promise to, you enter the terms into code and it's programmed into this smart contract that self executes. And so once a defined event or a triggering event occurs, this contract would execute itself and there's no need for any sort of human intervention. And so I thought, well, I do a lot of that stuff as a lawyer. So am I going to be put out of work? So I dug in deeper. It turns out smart contracts aren't as simple and straightforward as that, and I probably do have some sort of job security for a while. But after getting excited and scared about blockchain, I dug deeper. And I started looking into cryptocurrency white papers, and I fell into a cryptocurrency scam hole. And another goal that I have today is to help educate you so that you don't also fall into a crypto scam hole. So I started reading about this new ICO, which is a play on the term IPO, which is initial public offering. An ICO is an initial coin offering, and they're not as popular now as they were back in 2018 because the SEC has cracked down on them tremendously. But essentially, it's a crowd fundraise for a token to be used in some ecosystem. And these are all these blockchain buzzwords, an ecosystem created by some company for this cryptocurrency. And the sale is basically, you invest in this token and it'll develop value because it's the only token that can be used in this industry ecosystem. And so I read this one white paper for this particular token, and it sounded like such a brilliant idea. And I was falling for it. And I dug deeper and deeper, and I was ready to invest. And then I looked up the CEO, and she was a model with no business experience. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And then I found that her husband was a Russian businessman and political consultant. And I thought, that's an interesting pair. What's going on here? And then I looked and found that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of identical white papers that sounded just as intriguing for different industries. So they basically cut and paste this model for hundreds of different coins and industries. And I was like, probably should hold off on putting my money into this. And then, sure enough, a couple of months later, the SEC filed an enforcement action against this particular company. And then a couple of years after that, a class action lawsuit was filed. And this was after tens of millions of dollars had been raised by the company in an ICO. And then the CEO and her husband fled the country. And it didn't ultimately surprise me after I had done enough research. And I'm a pretty skilled internet sleuth. I think I spent about 10 hours digging into this company. So ultimately, the end result didn't surprise me, but it scared me because I consider myself to be a relatively intelligent person, but I had fallen for this, or almost fallen for this complete scam. And if I can nearly get swindled by a scam like this, I think a lot of people are going to be swindled by the allure of this mysterious new technology. So I went to school on blockchain. I took some Coursera classes. I don't work for Coursera, but it's a great system if you ever want to learn to code or learn more about stuff like this or about anything really. You can take a course, and I learned how to code using the blockchain. I'm not saying that I'm good at it. I wouldn't hire me to do it. But I wanted to become as knowledgeable as possible so that I could protect myself from falling for further scams. And so I could help to educate other people about the technology and the basics of it so that they don't fall for any sort of scam or get swindled by the allure of this sort of mysterious new technology. So most uses of blockchain don't involve cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is highly speculative and it exists in a legal gray area, and it's not the focus of this presentation. My goal is to educate you about the blockchain basics, give you a primer on the technical aspects without boring you to death, and talk about the downsides, and then how it's currently being used in the supply chain world, and give you a couple of other use cases. So you may have seen the headlines or you may have not, but some of the most popular blockchain headlines involve Walmart's IBM mango tracing study, where Walmart partnered with IBM and Hyperledger to manage the supply chain of mangoes, and they reduced the time required to trace a mango from seed to sale from about 6 days to 2 seconds. There's another headline by a very large company now about being able to serve the freshest coffee ever by tracing the bean on the blockchain from from the bean until it's the freshest cup of coffee that has ever been made. And all the while you're saving the environment and creating environmental sustainability. You can eliminate deed fraud. These are all big, game-changing headlines. But while I'm talking today, and when you read about the hyped up promises of blockchain, I want you to think critically and to ask questions like, is it actually the blockchain technology that's solving these problems? Or is it something else? And as I'll explain in more detail, blockchain keeps a permanent record of transactions that cannot be altered. So what happens if the information entered into the blockchain is not organized or not digitized? Or what if the person entering the data isn't being honest or they make a mistake? Then you have a permanent record of erroneous data. And I'm not sure that's very valuable. Going back to the mango example, if someone at the farm stuck the wrong label on something and they stuck the wrong barcode on a mango as it leaves the farm in Mexico, the mango could arrive at a store in Los Angeles, but it's been tracked on the blockchain as a banana the entire time. There's human error involved in the input into the blockchain. So if you're having human beings or even robots sticking a label onto something and then tracking it into the blockchain using that labeling process, if there's something wrong with the labeling process or there's an error or mistake, that immutable record really isn't all that helpful. So what are some of the things that blockchain promises? It promises to instill trust. That's kind of the number one purpose, what's claimed to be the number one purpose of blockchain, to make sure that no one is lying or cheating. It creates an immutable chain of events that can't be altered and a permanent record. It promises transparency, so all parties can see the full transaction history. It promises efficiency. It's distributed and decentralized, And I'll get more into the details of what that means later on in the presentation. But all parties have full access at all times. So there's no delay from waiting on a party to send information. It provides integrity. It's immutable and append only. So no one can go back and change the info that's there. And you can create and use self-executing contracts. So what are some of the potential uses include being able to track assets in a more reliable way. So you can trust the data in the chain is true because once it's entered, it cannot be altered. No one in the supply chain can go back and change a previous transaction. For example, a shipping company at a French port can't change the certificate of origin on a box of sparkling wine from southern France to say, oh, it's actually from Champagne, so it's Champagne. That's an example of how blockchain might enable someone to track their assets in a more reliable way. And so it gives confidence to entities that are higher up in a supply chain and to consumers. But keep in mind that confidence will only be established if people trust in the particular blockchain technology being used. And that's not guaranteed, as I'll explain in more detail. You can reduce, or blockchain promises to reduce the cost of verification of documentation. So for example, a customs agency that might participate in the blockchain, an entity up the supply chain can verify via blockchain that the customs data is authentic and trustworthy with the click of a button, presumably, theoretically. It can reduce volatility experienced in trade disruption. So we've seen a lot of trade disruption, obviously, with COVID and with Brexit. Blockchain can't make customs officials move faster, but it can help to create better representations of goods being shipped and lead to fewer delays by reducing the risk profile of exports and imports and enabling quicker checking by officials. Arguably, this solution doesn't require blockchain, only a digitized system. Less paper, more digital generally speeds up processes. For example, the Port of LA, which is not far from my house, and I can actually see the cargo ships in the harbor backed up right now. They use a system called Port Optimizer, and it's a cloud-based system that allows cargo companies and supply chain businesses to track port activity in real time. It organizes and digitizes the data to improve efficiency at the port. And to my knowledge, it doesn't use blockchain. Another thing that blockchain promises to do, or could be used for, is to open doors to financing by putting transaction histories on the blockchain and enabling banks to conduct quicker and more accurate due diligence. It can also be used to establish provenance, so verifying the origin of fine art or gemstones. And with respect to shortages, and I know this was a question that someone had asked before this presentation, blockchain can't prevent a shortage of raw materials, but it helps entities in the chain to identify more quickly and verify where potential shortages might exist, which enables these entities to act faster and find alternate solutions. But again, as you may be wondering, is blockchain required for that, or is it just digitization of the supply chain? And that's a good question. So Deloitte has conducted an annual survey on blockchain every year since 2018. And I thought some of these statistics were pretty interesting to look at. They basically asked globally senior executives at a number of different countries the following questions to find out what their perceptions are. And 88% of respondents said that the blockchain is broadly scalable and will eventually achieve mainstream adoption. 86% said that their exec team believes there's a compelling business case for the use of blockchain within their organization. And 54% in 2020 believe that it's overhyped. which I think that this statistic is the most interesting of all. And the trends show that as it becomes more widespread and universally adopted, more people believe it's overhyped. So 39% in 2018, 43% in 2019, 54% in 2020. And I'm very curious to see what it will say in 2021. They also asked the question of whether or not people think cryptocurrency is going to act as a substitute for fiat currency. And fiat currency means government-backed money, like the dollar. So 94% of respondents in China agree that digital assets like Bitcoin will be an alternative or a replacement for fiat currency in the next 5 to 10 years, versus 81% of US respondents. Those are pretty high numbers, and I'm wondering who they ask these questions to, because I feel like maybe it's Gen Z. Maybe I'm not hip to the latest trends, but I'm not really a believer that Bitcoin is going to take over the dollar in the next 5 to 10 years, but that's just me. Okay, now I'm going to get into the kind of dry, potentially boring aspect of this presentation, so please bear with me. We're going to get into the basic concepts of blockchain. There's no universally accepted definition of blockchain. It's basically just a new-ish way of organizing information. A blockchain generally is a network of multiple devices or nodes or computers connected to each other through the internet. And essentially, blockchain is a ledger which stores the record of what has come in and gone out in a distributed peer-to-peer manner after the transaction has been verified. It's a protocol for storing and managing information, and it involves verifying a transaction and locking that information into a block, which is linked to all previous transactions. And the next transaction is linked to the previous, and no party can go back and undo previous blocks once a transaction has been verified. And this is how it should work in theory. It doesn't always work this way. So for an example, a very oversimplified example in the supply chain, imagine that there is a box of raw materials, and the date, time, and weight of the raw materials is entered into the blockchain. And when it leaves the supplier on a truck, the date, time, and weight are logged into the next block in the chain. And then that box of raw materials is shipped overseas. And when it hits the entry point or entry port, the time, date, weight, and customs data is logged into the next block on the chain. And so when the manufacturer receives the raw materials, they can verify the origin, customs data, weight, and whatever information the parties agreed to track, because that data is stored in the blockchain. So the supplier and shipper can see that the manufacturer has received the goods and that they've not been altered. So you can imagine how every entity in that supply chain might benefit from being able to track the materials to verify their origin and location and ensure that nothing has been lost or removed along the way. But you may also be wondering, how does all that data get entered into the blockchain? And that's a key question to keep in mind when you're dealing with blockchain companies in your work. As promising as blockchain might be, it doesn't solve the problem of data entry and human error, as I mentioned before. The blockchain is only as good as its input. So if you're dealing with liquids or some other substance to which you can't attach an RFID tag or a barcode and use a scanner to track, you're likely going to have human beings gathering information and entering it into the system. If you create an immutable, auditable chain of information based on erroneous data, it's not worth much. Further, the user interfaces aren't immutable, auditable solutions like the underlying blockchain. So unless the tech evolves, which it's evolving rapidly, we still have weaknesses in how we communicate with the blockchain itself. So when you, the user, are looking at the data logged in the blockchain. You're not looking at the blockchain itself unless you're a software engineer. You're looking at some user-friendly interface created to communicate with the blockchain, to translate the data into something that you can use. So bear with me on this slide. It can be a little dry and confusing and complicated, but I'm going to go slowly through it and then come back to it again to help you sort of understand these main concepts. And it's not exhaustive. This is just a list of kind of the main points and the main categories. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different blockchains and protocols now. So it's not one size fits all. So Bitcoin, Ethereum, Hyperledger, Corda, all of these are different blockchains, and they each have their own protocol. They're completely different systems. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different blockchain systems. There are three main categories of blockchain, but as the tech evolves and improves, we will see more variation. Public blockchains are mining-based blockchains, and Bitcoin and Ethereum are both public. Anyone can become a miner by downloading the software. Public chains are verified through mining, which means cryptographers compete to solve puzzles in order to win Bitcoin, Ether, or whatever coin is native to that blockchain. It's also called proof of work, or POW for short. Every node has access to complete information on the blockchain, and no one party has control. So therefore, it's decentralized. Users can conduct non-reversible transactions without the need to rely on or trust a third party. There's no middleman. And this is very appealing to the kids in Gen Z and Elon Musk. Ethereum can also facilitate other protocols and dApps, the dApps, built on top of its network. Private or consortium blockchains, I tend to group them together. Consensus is reached in a variety of ways. Selective endorsement, proof of authority, there's little to no mining involved. And parties with approval power verify the transaction. It's a permissioned network with restricted memberships of known approved participants who agree in advance on who is in charge of verifying transactions and what the rules are. Private blockchains are not decentralized, and therefore the true believers in the public decentralized Bitcoin model, they don't agree that these are actually blockchain solutions. So they don't call them blockchain. But these solutions call themselves blockchain. So I'm just trying to confuse you now. Hyperledger, Corda, and Quorum are permissioned networks where only trusted entities can join the network and verify transactions. And unlike Ethereum and Bitcoin, permissioned blockchains maintain strict control over accessibility. So only authorized members can access and use the platform and the tools, and each participant has to obtain permission to join the network. So this prevents external parties from accessing valuable information and making changes to the network. It speeds up transactions, which is a huge problem with the public chains, because not every node needs to approve. And I think someone asked a question along these lines before the presentation, isn't it slowed down if every single node has every single copy of every transaction? That's going to slow the system down, and that's right. So these private enterprise solutions, they're not decentralized like the public solution. So it speeds up transactions because not every node needs to approve. You're not using up energy like Bitcoin and Ethereum are, but you've basically undone the benefits that blockchain was intended to provide in the first place. So you've reintroduced a middleman, and you've given someone or a group of people or entities control over the network. And therefore, the system is no longer really this community, public, immutable chain. Arguably, the private and consortium networks are subject to manipulation or destruction by whoever is in control. So a party in control with authority could theoretically undo blocks in the chain. And that's a problem that these enterprise solutions are going to have to grapple with. In a public chain, it's truly decentralized. The kids like this. The Gen Z and the Elon Musk people are very into the decentralized Bitcoin model. No single authority has control. But the same features that make proof of work blockchains secure also make the barriers to participating in the network as a node very high. So it would be very difficult for one of us to go home and set up our computer as a node and compete with the other miners to win Bitcoin by verifying transactions. Operating a mining rig and paying for the hardware and electricity costs is too expensive for the average user. And mining on many major networks has been monopolized by large-scale mining operations that have gained influence in network governance. So this is a picture of a cryptocurrency mine in Russia. Proof of work networks are energy intensive and accordingly, they're environmentally damaging. The computational power needed to solve proofs of work requires a lot of electricity. So for example, the Bitcoin network itself has the same annual carbon footprint as the country of New Zealand. So this photo is from Russia, but if you Google cryptocurrency mining farm, you will find all kinds of videos and photos from these crazy mining operations in China and Russia and all over the world. And they tend to be located in very remote areas where energy is cheap. And they set up in China, they set up next to substations in the middle of nowhere. ASIC or ASIC mining is huge in Northwest China. And ASIC means application specific integrated circuit. It's a device designed for the sole purpose of mining digital currency. And this photo shows racks of ASIC devices and power units. So all of these devices are solving puzzles and trying to mine for Bitcoin. China accounts for around 65% of all Bitcoin mining globally. Inner Mongolia alone accounts for about 8% due to its cheap energy. In comparison, the United States accounts for about 7% of all Bitcoin mining in the world. So Inner Mongolia failed to meet government assessment targets for energy use in 2019. And in response, the government laid out plans to reduce energy consumption. And part of those plans involved shutting down existing cryptocurrency mining projects by April 2021 and not approving any new cryptocurrency mining projects. And solving for the energy consumption and environmental issues has been a big focus of tech development in the blockchain industry. And so solutions are starting to emerge. One of those is proof of stake. So Ethereum 2.0 is using proof of stake. So instead of miners, they have validators. Their validators are node operators that validate data similarly to proof of work systems, but there's no energy intensive mining process to earn the right to validate. So instead of working to solve proofs of work, validators stake their tokens to become eligible for selection as a validator. So basically they hand over Bitcoin or Ether, and then they conduct they conduct the validation action. And if they act nefariously or incompetently, they lose their stake. So the network keeps their Bitcoin or Ether, and they're slashed and removed from the network. So there's incentive for people who are validators to do the right thing. So that's one way to make public blockchain more energy efficient, but still public and decentralized. So let's go back. I'm going to go back to this overwhelming slide and talk a little bit more about the private enterprise consortium blockchain. So a private blockchain is controlled by a centralized entity, which determines who can act with the blockchain, verify transactions, and who can view the information recorded on the blockchain. A consortium blockchain is a distributed ledger controlled by several entities, each of which operates a network node, participates in consensus, and has permissions to view certain types of information. These networks are not decentralized, and the technology is often referred to as distributed ledger technology, or DLT, rather than blockchain. So they use proof of authority rather than proof of work or proof of stake. Most of the enterprise uses that you see, all the business cases you see, are mostly permissioned consortium blockchains. So they bring together entities within an industry ecosystem. For example, a supply chain consortium might include transporters, suppliers, manufacturers, regulators, and retailers, and they would all agree upfront what the rules are, who has authority to verify and validate a transaction, and whoever gets to make the decision has the authority. And that is why this method is called proof of authority, because instead of mining competitively to validate a block, an entity with authority checks to see if criteria has been met and approves the transaction. So most businesses, banks, and governments don't want a public blockchain because the parties are anonymous. They give up their control, and mining is wasteful and slow. So businesses and governments want to have control over who's participating in their network. Public blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum are arguably censorship resistant, and they offer broad ecosystems for the development of apps and platforms. Consortium blockchains, however, offer faster transaction processing times, and they're easier to modify, but they're walled off from the public with limited usage outside of the private consortium. So now let's talk about smart contracts. They're supposedly self-executing contracts whose terms are written into code. And once the terms of the contract have been satisfied, or upon a defined triggering event, the contract executes itself according to the coded terms. So the terms of an agreement would have to be negotiated upfront and written down first, and then translated into code for a smart contract. In real estate, for example, a smart contract could serve as an automated escrow officer. And the purpose of an escrow company is to be a trusted holding place for money while certain conditions to a contract are pending fulfillment. The escrow officer releases funds upon the occurrence of certain conditions according to previously agreed upon instructions. And if you've ever been in escrow, you know that they will not act unless they have specific instructions to do so, and that the qualifying events have actually occurred. A smart contract functions pretty much the same way without the need for human intervention. And there's no, minimal fees, and reduce that risk of human error. So if we can develop a universally accepted or even regionally accepted method of exchanging property using blockchain, then we might eliminate the need for title insurance and title companies. We could eliminate deed fraud and really cut out a lot of the middlemen that are currently involved in real estate transactions. And I say this as a broker and a lawyer who could be put out of work if this actually comes to fruition. But the protection of existing jobs is a big consideration and big concern for the state and local governments that have been exploring these technologies. And that's one of the reasons why the Cook County blockchain pilot, Cook County is no longer using blockchain to record land title. The state of Delaware is, they set out to do a pilot where they were going to use blockchain to log and track corporate information. But then they realized that that was going to put a lot of industries out of business, and Delaware didn't want to do that. So that, job security and concern for that is a big consideration in adopting this new technology. But anyway, that being said, if you think about it, title insurance really is the poster child for why something like blockchain is needed in the real estate industry. Why do you have to pay an insurance company to prove that you own a property when you've already recorded a deed and the entire title history is on record with the county? Why do you have to take that extra step and pay an insurance company to support the fact that you own it? One of my colleagues likened it to getting a driver's license at the DMV. And then you walk out into the parking lot and a man approaches you and offers to sell you insurance to prove that that driver's license is actually yours. It's absurd if you really think about it. And we have rampant cases of deed fraud across the country. And even though county recorders require notarized signatures and impose all kinds of requirements on recording companies, we still have these problems. So with all that, we can't trust the system. Will blockchain be the solution? I don't know. The answer still isn't clear. Remains to be seen. So let's switch gears and get back into some use cases of blockchain. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the more famous cases is this Walmart Hyperledger Mango experiment. So Hyperledger is probably the most well-known permissioned blockchain consortium. It's a Linux Foundation project in an open source community. Hyperledger collaborates with more than 250 member companies in finance, banking, not baking, Internet of Things, supply chains, manufacturing, and technology. And Walmart wanted to use Hyperledger to bring transparency to the food supply chain. The problem that they were facing is that when an outbreak of foodborne illness happens, it can take days or weeks to find the source. So better traceability could help save lives by allowing companies to act faster and protect the livelihoods of farmers by only discarding produce from affected farms. The approach that they used was Walmart and IBM created a food traceability system based on Hyperledger Fabric, and they ran 2 proof of concept projects to test the system. One traced mangoes in Walmart's US stores, and the other traced pork sold in its China stores. For the pork in China, certificates of authenticity were uploaded to the blockchain, bringing more trust to a system where that used to be a serious issue. And for mangoes in the US, as I mentioned earlier, they were able to reduce the time it took to trace a mango back to its original seed from 6 days to 2.2 seconds. So now Walmart can trace the origin of over 25 products from 5 different suppliers using a Hyperledger blockchain. They've started requiring suppliers of fresh leafy greens to trace their products using this system. But now I want to talk about promises versus reality. There's a commercial by a very large international company, and I wanted to play it for you, but I'm frankly a little bit scared of being sued by them. So the commercial has this ethereal music playing and kind of this beautiful heavenly visual. And the narrator talks about how blockchain is enabling them to take a coffee bean from the farm and get it to the freshest cup of coffee you'll ever taste in your whole life and saving the planet at the same time. And it's this dreamy kind of thing that is hard for me to believe. A lot of the things you read about blockchain claim to be revolutionary and life-changing. Like blockchain is going to cure cancer and save the planet and make everyone in the world trust and love each other. So with the next few slides, I want to dig deeper into each of the main promises that we hear about blockchain and discuss some of the downsides that seem to get buried under these flowery promises. So the main claim is that blockchain is immutable or unable to be changed. But the written data could still be tampered with and the blockchain rebuilt as long as the majority of the participants or miners have reached a consensus. And this is especially true in consortium and private blockchains, where the number of miners is generally limited in comparison with public blockchains. There's also a risk of a 51% attack in a public blockchain. So if a bad actor or group amasses more than 51% of CPU power, that bad actor could alter the immutable records in the blockchain. And this is something that I think about when I see massive mining farms in countries that have historically had antagonistic relationships with the United States. Blockchain is said to be unhackable. I've never thought that that was true. And it's not entirely true. There have been hacks, mostly on points interfacing with blockchain via wallets. That's what you use if you want to use dollars to buy tokens, apps, and bugs in smart contracts. So the interfaces used to communicate with blockchain are often the target of hacking attempts. And a couple of the more famous cases are the Mt. Go attack, which was a Bitcoin exchange. In 2014, 750,000 Bitcoin were lost, resulting in a Bitcoin price crash. And today, one Bitcoin is worth about $57,000. So today's value of the Bitcoin lost in that hack is $42 billion. In 2016, DAO, DAO, is a program through which investors could buy tokens using Ether. A hacker withdrew 3.6 million Ether. Today, that would be worth roughly $6 billion. Then we have quantum computing. I'm a lawyer. I have not taken a math class since high school, although I probably need to take another one. So I don't fully understand quantum computing, but Google has apparently achieved quantum supremacy, which means one of their computers was able to perform a calculation in 200 seconds that would have taken the world's most powerful supercomputer 10,000 years. So that would mean the calculation, which involved generated random numbers, is essentially impossible on a traditional non-quantum computer. And one of the things a quantum computer can do is break the mathematical difficulty underlying most currently used cryptography, like that used in Bitcoin and Ethereum in the mining. So since Google announced that it achieved quantum supremacy, there has been a lot of talk predicting the demise of currently used cryptography in general and Bitcoin in particular. And then we get back to the input problem. So even if blockchain is truly unhackable and immutable, that still doesn't solve the input problem, which involves human error and unpredictability. Is it really solving the problem of freshness and speed, or is that because there are RFID tags and scanners? Blockchain is really only adding trust to the process. And if it's private enterprise, that trust level is still suspicious. Control over the chain in a private or consortium blockchain is still centralized in one party. Information has to be organized and digitized for this to work. And blockchain isn't going to magically fix a system that is disorganized and not digitized. In the coffee bean example from that ethereal commercial, that company promises the ability to provide the freshest coffee ever with proof of provenance using blockchain. But the beans, the individual coffee beans, aren't marked with RFID tags. They're not tagged with a barcode. They're put into a bag or a box, and that bag or that box is tagged. So what is preventing the farmer from dropping in a handful of low quality beans into the box of high quality beans? Things like that are problems that the blockchain cannot solve, at least in its current forms. Then we have the problem of energy consumption. So the energy required to mine one Bitcoin is 5,500 kilowatt hours, which is half the annual consumption of an average US household. There are 12.5 Bitcoin created through mining every 10 minutes. So that is an awful lot of energy consumption. Then we have the issue of privacy laws. So the GDPR is the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, and it requires it requires a number of things, but there are two main things that it requires that blockchain is not compatible with. Number one, it requires an identifiable controller against whom people can enforce their legal rights. So a distributed and decentralized ledger doesn't lend itself to that. There's no identifiable controller. So it's not in compliance with the GDPR. Secondly, data has to be able to be modified or erased for something to be compliant with the GDPR. And obviously, that's basically the opposite of what a public blockchain does. I'm sure we'll see some innovations and workarounds in the future. But regulators will always be pretty far behind the technology. And lawyers are typically the last people to innovate. And I can say that because I'm just making fun of myself. And then we have the issue of whose blockchain will you trust? There are hundreds, if not thousands, of private enterprise blockchain protocols and patent applications pending, and that number is increasing. So you have to trust the middlemen as well, the developers, the apps, the wallets, all the points touching the blockchain, and whatever is connecting your existing cloud system to the blockchain. You have to trust that as well. Ultimately, if this becomes widely accepted, people are going to have to choose one system over another. And how will we decide which blockchain system is the most trustworthy? It's unlikely that different blockchains will be able to work together. So in the context of, for example, international trade, some countries and regions may adopt one blockchain while others adopt a different one. And you're still going to have a country of origin certification problem if we can't get every trading nation to agree on one system. So some of the benefits that blockchain promises to bring to the supply chain are visibility and efficiency, where all parties can see what's happening at all points in the supply chain simultaneously. And it promises to provide tools that can allow each entity to be more flexible in the face of short-term disruptions, enable manufacturers to capture data-based insights that will help optimize their performance. But to fully unlock these benefits, we need legislation and regulation to adapt to electronic documents. Transition points in the trade process, like ports, terminals, customs agencies, need to become digitally enabled. And maybe COVID has accelerated that. But based on the lineup of cargo ships, it seems like there's still some serious delays. In cross-border trade, documents have to be compliant with multiple regulatory regimes. Backup documents of certificates of origin will differ depending on where the good is going. In a number of pilot blockchain programs, blockchain transaction is done in parallel execution to the paper process because the domestic or regional regulations still require paper or physical stamps. So they do the blockchain transactions plus the paper. They're still doing both. COVID has been disruptive to supply chains, but blockchain promises to bring instant visibility into the lower levels of the supply chain in a more reliable way. It could help businesses react more quickly and reliably when they encounter problems. As an example, there's a small business that was recently featured on 60 Minutes, and they had contracts to provide state and local governments in the United States with PPE right at the beginning of the pandemic. They had an agreement with a manufacturer in China, but despite that agreement, their orders did not materialize or they were severely delayed. It's unclear whether the materials were stolen or whether they were sold to another bidder for a higher dollar value or another buyer who had better political connections. But the end result was that this company couldn't perform under its agreements with the state and local governments in the United States. And things got very ugly for the business owners. Theoretically, if the manufacturers in China and the business had been part of the same blockchain system, then the business would have had insight into the status and location of the goods at all times. And they would have been able to provide their customers in the United States with more reliable and transparent information. But you may be thinking, I'm making some big assumptions. This assumes that the Chinese manufacturer would be willing to participate in a US-China blockchain system, and that whoever is entering the data on the Chinese end is acting honestly. And those are big assumptions to make. So I'll go through a few more examples in the context of supply chain and trade before concluding today. Contour is a trade finance solution on Corda, which is the permissioned blockchain network. It's used to represent letters of credit on the blockchain. So a letter of credit is basically a guarantee from a bank that a buyer is going to pay the seller on a specific date once certain conditions are satisfied. And if the buyer fails to pay, then the bank has to cover the bill. So the letter of credit process is cumbersome. It involves physical documents and manual processes, many stakeholders. There are certificates, checks, hard copies and originals, bills of lading, and small discrepancies can lead to the rejection of documents and the need to resubmit. And this in turn means money. There are time delays, sometimes for days, demurrage costs thousands of dollars per day in ports, and pressurized working capital through fines and late payments slows everything down. The solution put forth by Contour is to put the letters of credit on the blockchain. And Contour has already carried out live pilots in 14 countries, as well as a global trial with more than 50 banks and businesses, which reduced processing times for letters of credit by over 90%. So from 5 to 10 days to under 24 hours. And obviously, when issuing a letter of credit, a bank is going to want to do some heavy due diligence because they don't want to be left holding the bag. The bank needs to check the buyer's creditworthiness, assets, and financial status, among other things. So the Contour process starts with a digital letter of credit drafting. So the buyer and seller work together to create the letter of credit. And then the banks advise, issue, and confirm the letter of credit on the platform. After confirmation and agreement from both parties, then the real-time tracking process starts. And entities can integrate Contour with SDocs and Bolero's electronic bill of lading in the system. These are companies that already digitize trade documents. So Contour works with existing systems. And I know someone asked that question before the presentation, if we already have a resource planning system, which every company already does, how does it work with those systems? The answer is that some blockchains will work with existing systems and others don't. So my advice is if you're considering a blockchain system, look for something that will work with your existing systems, unless your existing system is terrible. So getting back to Contour, any discrepancies will be highlighted in the blockchain system. If there are errors, all of the parties will see them at the same time, and therefore they can address them quicker. The seller gets all the instructions from the bank directly on the Contour blockchain. There's no need for reconciliation at the end of the transaction because all parties are simultaneously updated with the exact same information. So I want to talk about a couple of aerospace examples because my understanding is that we have a number of people in the audience that are in the aerospace industry. So hopefully this will strike a chord with you. Delays or shortages at the lowest levels reverberate through the system in aerospace. Production requires the interplay of a lot of complicated, highly regulated steps. In the finished goods, the airplanes have very high values. MRO, which stands for maintenance, repair, and overhaul of airplanes, is a highly regulated process. And a key issue is updating and keeping track of the logbook, which records servicing for a given airplane. Mistakes are costly because the regulations say that if a logbook is lost, you might have to scrap the whole plane. The aerospace industry has to function in a really tight regulatory environment, which requires vetting of all parts used by any aircraft. And there are a lot. The parts are resold several times, which makes it challenging to track their history. And apparently, counterfeit parts are making their way into the supply chain. So, airlines and other industry participants have to spend a significant amount of time and money to ensure the quality of the aircraft parts supply chain. So Honeywell has, they've created this go direct trade using the Hyperledger blockchain. The problem that they aim to solve was that there's an inefficient market for airplane parts. There wasn't a lot of online transactions because it's not easy to trust that you're getting the real thing when you buy online. Go direct trade uses blockchain to overcome that trust barrier. So, as you know, airplane part sales require certification from the FAA, and each part has to be documented with a complete history of its ownership, use, and repairs. According to Honeywell, an encrypted digital trail cuts the need for paperwork and makes it quick and easy to check the certification and origin of a part. So a buyer can view data like the entire life cycle of a part, the number of hours it was in service, any and all repairs made and by who, when, and where, and all previous owners of the part. And the starting point for this system is at the dismantling of an aircraft, which is a process that usually takes between 2 and 2.5 months. Parts are cleaned and tagged as removed, and then some might need to be repaired or recertified, which takes more time. And then they need to be listed for sale. But with this new system, the dismantler takes a picture of the part and generates an as removed quality tag, and it's listed on the blockchain and the Go Direct Trade store. And with the listing process, it's possible to get the data for all the dismantled aircraft parts listed on the store within 48 hours of dismantling. So it's supposed to speed up that process. And if a part is no longer usable, the fact that it's retired will also be logged, preventing it from being used again in the future. But you may be wondering, is blockchain required for this? If everyone in the aerospace parts industry agreed to use one central database to track every airplane part, wouldn't that provide the same result? And I'm not saying that that's possible. It seems like quite a task, but why does it need to be done using blockchain? If it's a private or enterprise blockchain, don't we still have the risk of interested parties altering past transactions? Which brings me to my favorite example, which is the Moog, Veripart, and Verichain system. Moog is a US manufacturer of flight control systems, and they are working with partners to create a blockchain-based solution called Veripart, which is used to track 3D printed components. So they would track and trace the provenance of high quality parts in a heavily regulated market. Using Veripart, the paper or disconnected digital records are replaced by an immutable chain of events and operations. So what they've done is they've identified a gap in blockchain tracking solutions, which is the link between the digital and the physical world. And this gets back to the input problem that I keep talking about. And this project sets out to address the input problem, and it has a very cool solution. If we have humans involved in identifying things, labeling and scanning and inputting them into the blockchain, then there's always room for human error and dishonesty. But Moog's team has come up with a really interesting solution to create a digital representation of a part referred to as a digital twin. So they use a service called Feature Print by Aletheion, and it uses off-the-shelf cameras and proprietary software, which I'm sure is pretty pricey, to transform the unique surface characteristics of individual objects into a digital ID. So in the same way that a human can be identified by their fingerprint, they've come up with a system where any part can be identified by points of interest on its surface, photographed with a camera, and that identification is converted into code. Don't ask me how, because I don't understand how they do that. And so to test the theory, Moog manufactured 20 parts that included secret features. Then they sent the parts to Aletheion, and Aletheion registered each part by creating a detailed fingerprint of the item based on imaging. Then they smashed up the part. So they dropped it, they grit blasted it, they used a motorized grinder, they smashed them up. And ultimately, after all of that, Aletheion was able to positively identify all 20 parts, even after the aggressive wear, using this feature print ID. So this digital ID is used to log and trace parts in a blockchain, and they seem to have solved the problem of input for this industry, at least. And so Moog says that Veripart reduces the potential for counterfeit and ensures the original manufacturer retains design ownership and can aggregate and reward intellectual property from all stakeholders. They say that Veripart end items are guaranteed authentic and hold traceable certification pedigrees for all requirements, intellectual property, processes, and materials used to produce them. And this digital fingerprint system is AI. That's the next hot thing, artificial intelligence. I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about that. And the last example that I want to talk about in the aerospace industry is the CETA MRO Blockchain Alliance. So CETA is an international company providing support to the air transport industry. And along with airline industry partners, they launched the MRO Blockchain Alliance to track, trace, and record aircraft parts. So the alliance includes airlines, lessors, original equipment manufacturers, such as engine producers, logistics suppliers, and maintenance providers. And the problem they set out to address was that there's no global database. There's incomplete data sharing and only partial digitalization in a complex logistics chain that can span several stakeholders over the lifetime of each part. And the solution that they've proposed is they believe the use of blockchain will simplify and speed up parts tracking while enabling the secure sharing of information between industry stakeholders. And PricewaterhouseCoopers estimates that the use of blockchain could increase aerospace industry revenue by as much as 4%, or $40 billion, while cutting MRO costs globally by around 5%, or $3.5 billion. So the Alliance will use blockchain to record and track two separate strands of information for each part, a digital thread and a digital passport. The digital thread provides the real-time status, chain of custody, and back to birth track and trace of the part over time. And the digital passport, like a human passport, provides the indisputable identity of a part and contains other vital data like certification of airworthiness to prove ownership. So now I want to get back to, hopefully I haven't lost you and hopefully you're not sleeping after lunch, but hopefully I've still got you. I want to revisit the 2018 white paper cases. I wrote a white paper for ICMA in 2018 and talked about some of the local and state government uses of blockchain. And I briefly touched on them earlier, but I looked into the city of Berkeley. The city of Berkeley had been planning to issue municipal bonds using the blockchain. And as far as I can tell, and by the way, people are very tight-lipped about this, so I can't get people to talk to me about what's going on. But as far as I can tell, they haven't done the municipal bond issuance, and there's no current plan to do it. Cook County, Illinois is no longer tracking land title using blockchain, and the state of Delaware is not actively tracking corporate data using the blockchain. But LO3 is moving forward and making progress with the Brooklyn microgrid using a blockchain system called Pando. And this is a pretty exciting use case. So the Brooklyn microgrid is a blockchain-based peer-to-peer energy trading system. And in 2018, they were buying and selling tokens for energy credits at the time I published the white paper. In 2020, they received regulatory approval to conduct a 12-month pilot program for energy trading on their blockchain platform. So it basically enables you, if you're part of the microgrid and you own solar panels, you can sell your excess solar energy to your neighbor via secure blockchain. The pilot began in early 2020 with 40 prosumers. Those are the people who own the solar panels, and 200 consumers are participating in it. So the 200 consumers are buying the energy from the 40 prosumers. Consumers can bid for excess energy retailed on the market by prosumers using their app. And LO3 just closed Series B funding to raise money to further develop Pando, which is the blockchain solution. And they're calling it a white label solution that enables electricity grids to add a consumer app and marketplace so that users can choose renewables and even provide energy to the grid from their own solar panels. And they've started to expand into international markets as well. And there are pros and cons to decentralizing energy markets. The power outages in California and Texas recently make me wonder if decentralizing is a good or a bad idea. So we've made it to the end. Thank you for sticking with me. This can be a pretty heavy topic. I hope that you've found it somewhat interesting and that you've learned at least one thing today. My ultimate opinion, to answer the question of whether blockchain is overhyped or critical game-changing tech, I think a lot of it is overhyped and a lot of it's absolutely ridiculous, like the NFT art and crypto kitties. Recently, there has been some mainstream investment in Bitcoin. Billions of dollars of mainstream investors have gone into Bitcoin. And tens of millions of dollars have been used to buy digital art NFTs like this rainbow kitty. I frankly don't get it. I just don't get it. There are some promising uses of the underlying blockchain technology in its many forms and applications. I think organizing information in a way that it can be used on the blockchain is probably the most revolutionary and productive thing that a business can do. Digitizing and storing information in a reliable, usable way is really what enhances trust and efficiency, regardless of whether you implement blockchain. For example, if you take the AI aspects of what Moog is doing with Aletheion, creating the digital fingerprint for objects, and combine that with the port optimizer cloud system that's being used at the Port of LA, you have a very secure, high visibility system that arguably has no need for blockchain. However, blockchain has garnered so much attention and popularity that even if it's not worth the investment, businesses involved in certain supply chains may ultimately be forced to adopt it if they want to continue participating in the market. For example, Walmart is requiring some of its suppliers to use blockchain to track farm goods. So even if it's overhyped and not really necessary, we may be forced to use it anyway. All right. Thanks for having me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference. And if you ever want to talk about this, if you have any questions for me, please feel free to send me an email or call me. And my information is on the slide. Thank you so much.